Okay, let us continue with the uh, motive related algorithms. Now, today we will learn about motive finding. So, it is slightly different than motive search that we learned in the last class. So, to define this problem of motive finding, let us have a statement. Let's say that given a set of sequences. So these are longer sequences. Uh, find out the most overrepresented motif, right? So what it means is that we have a set of longer sequences, and in this set of sequences we are going to find out uh, a shorter sequence which is motif, a shorter sequence, let us say one small sequence here, which is actually overrepresented in all these sequences. This is your first sequence, second, third, fourth, and fifth. So if this is some sequence, maybe a Tata box or any other motive, so we need to find out that in what is this sequence in a set of sequence which is represented in most of them. So there can be this sequence over here, there can be this sequence, this sequence, this sequence. We do not know which one is overrepresented in the all the sequences. For example, let us assume that somehow we got to know after running the algorithm, this is the motif which is actually present in many of these sequences. We also present, let us say this is actually present in most of them, this particular motif, right? So we need to find out where along this sequence and this sequence and all the other sequence we have a motif like this which is overrepresented. Now you might wonder, uh, where do we get such a scenario in biology to find out? So uh, think about a experiment. Let us say think about an experiment where you took a set of cells, cell population, whatever tissue it was, whatever cell line it was, and what you did was, uh, I'm just taking a hypothetical scenario, you gave some perturbation, some induction, right? So there is some environmental induction using a drug, a hormone, or some other molecule, small molecule, protein, or any signal, and then you measure the gene expression in these cells, right? What is the expression level of, let's say, gene 1, and what is the expression level of gene 2, gene 3, and all the other genes up to 30,000 genes. So what is the expression level here? How many RNA copies, mRNA copies are out there? So let us say we measure this by some technique, and there are techniques, and I can so microarray is one technique, and RNA sequencing is another technique. So we will learn about these techniques later on, but this is possible that we can measure the expression of all the genes inside, right? Now we need to find out, okay, so this is the expression level, and you need to have a control also, right? Let us say I have a control cell population, and here I did not give any induction, so this is control population, uninduced population of cells, and I did the same thing on these set of cells. So I have two set of expression values. One is the treated one, let us say this is the treated one, and then I will have another one in parallel to this one, which will be control one, right? So for each gene I have two values, the control one and the treated one and the control one, and from this data I can find out what all genes are upregulated in treated condition or downregulated in treated condition. So genes which are upregulated in treated condition, and likewise I can find out the genes, and you can have some criteria to say when a gene is upregulated or downregulated. So basically if there is a two-fold change with the p-value of 0.05 or the corrected p-value of 0.05, then we say that the gene is upregulated or downregulated. Now we will see those criteria. We will learn about differential gene expression in the genomics classes, but in this class, for the sake of simplicity, consider that we have a method to find out what are the genes which are upregulated and what are the genes which are downregulated. Now let us say here is a set of genes which are upregulated. Okay, so the upregulated one I'll draw in red color. So yeah, these are the genes which are upregulated, and let us say we had total such 1000 such genes. Okay, what I am interested now is what is common among these genes? Is there a common regulator? Is there a common regulator of these genes? Is there a common regulator, common regulatory pathway, common regulation of these genes? So the way one can find out is the following. If there is a common regulator, then the motif of a common transcription factor will be present on the promoter of this gene here, right? And so is the case of all the promoters over here of these genes. So there will be a common transcription factor binding site, right? Common transcription factor binding site. Now this is very similar to the problem that I posed earlier, and that is, what is the overrepresented motif? So TSBS is nothing but a motif, right, in a set of sequences. So the set of sequences is your promoter sequences, right? These are promoter sequences. So given a set of promoter sequences which are coming from this experiment, of course, we need to find out the common regulator by looking at the motif in those promoters. What is the motif which is overrepresented in these promoters, right? So this is one scenario where we want to find out the motif in a set of sequences, because I do not know. If I do a exact search of a particular known binding site, then I will miss a lot of them, because we know that there are variations in binding sites, and moreover we may not know what is the common regulator. There could be, we might be interested in a de novo regulator. Let us say I do not know what transcription factor regulates this. So maybe once I find a particular motif, that can guide us that there is a transcription factor which actually recognizes this motif, and then we can search for that transcription factor through follow-up experiments. And we can also search if that motif is actually present in motif databases. Okay, if the factor is already studied and we are not aware of, we can search for this factor in the known databases of motifs, and if this is present there, then we have a candidate transcription factor for our experiment. So this is one scenario. There can be another scenario where let us say we performed let us say this is your DNA chromatin, right? So and then we have a particular protein binding here on promoters, enhancers, wherever. and we performed a chip experiment to pull down the sequences. So basically we pull down the sequences regions which are actually bound with your factor of interest through antibody. We will learn about chip experiments later on. We pull down these sequences. What are those sequences? These are these smaller sequences that we pull down where this factor is binding, right? Now the way we do this is following. The first thing what we do is we have to cross link. We need to cross link uh, your chromatin so that your transcription factor is actually fixed here. Now you use formaldehyde crosslinker to cross link this in the inside the cell. So this is happening inside the cell, inside the nucleus. In fact, inside the nucleus here we are having this thing going on, right? Now the second thing is we have to, because we need to identify the smaller sequences, but we have a big whole chromosomal sequence, we need to actually fragment this DNA. We need to chop this DNA into smaller pieces. So there are two ways you do it. We either do the sonication or we do the restriction digestion. Now sonication is a physical method, restriction digestion is a enzymatic method to fragment the DNA. So once we do this, what we get is smaller chunks of chromatin regions DNA, and in some of these our protein of interest is actually bound, right? Let us say it is bound here, bound here, bound here, and bound here, and there are a lot of other fragments where our factor is not bound, right? There are a lot of other factors, other DNA regions. Now we need to, what we do, we take an antibody and we pull down these small DNA fragments of our interest, because you know the antibodies are specific to our factor, and we pull it down. So as a result what happens is we ended up having a population of sequences which are bound with R factor, right? So they are bound with R factor, and now we need to get rid of this factor because we are interested in the sequence only, we are not interested in the protein. So we actually do the D cross linking. So we had formaldehyde cross linking. So what we do, so we use paraformaldehyde here, PFA, in the liquid form. Now if you heat it at 60 degree, paraformaldehyde will be converted to formaldehyde gas and it will evaporate, and this will detach from it, and then we purify DNA, isolate DNA, and this final population of DNA sequences are the set of sequences where our factor was bound. So these are the binding sites. Now it turns out that when we do the sonication, sonication gives us, this is the popular method in chip, the sonication. Restriction digestion is more popular for some other methods like Hi-C that we will learn later on. Sonication is so almost 99% of the researchers in the field, they use sonication for chip experiments. Sonication gives you on an average 1000 base pair size of the fragment. Now here is the problem. This is 1000 base pair, but the actual site, this is regulatory size where the factor is binding, is 4 base pair to 20 base pair, right? These are very small as compared to the total fragment length that we got. So each of this is basically 1000 base pair. Of course there will be variation, some will be 500 base pairs, others will be 100 base pair, some will be 2000 base pair, and so on, but on an average they will be 1000 base pair. On this sequence we will have smaller sequence which are the actual binding site, right? So we again landed up to same problem. We have a longer set of sequence and we need to find out where exactly on this sequence is our binding site. We do not know, right? So we ended up to same problem. What is that? We given a set of sequences, find out the overrepresented motif. So likewise, you might have other scenarios based on your hypothesis, experiment design, and so on, where you will be landing up to this problem of motif finding. Now, how do we find it? So let us say that in the beginning we don't think about an algorithm, but let us look at what is the need of algorithm for motif finding. Why can't we use the brute force search? Now assume that okay, so let us again draw some sequences. These are some sequences, longer sequences, in which we are supposed to find out a overrepresented motif. Now the length of this sequence is, let us say, 1000 base pair, and total number of these, so this is n, let us say this is n, and the total number of these sequences are is t. Let us say there were 100 such sequences, right, in a hypothetical scenario, and the motif length is L. Okay, motif is the small sequence that we want to search into this set of larger sequences. So and then we have to search, so there will be a lot of windows over here. So motif length is L, so this is the motif with length L. Now we do not know this motif, right? So what we need to do is, we need to, let us say L is defined, so we need to make L windows over this, right? So we need to make sliding windows over this. So let us say length L, and then the next one, and then so on. We make these sliding windows till the end of the sequence, right? Alright, so now we need to check. So in a brute force search, how will we find out the overrepresented sequence? Each of these windows, okay, we need to find in other sequences. Let us say we work on these two sequences first. We again get the windows here, right? Sliding windows of length L, and so on till the length of the sequence. Actually not the length of the sequence, it should be n minus L, right, because the last position will not have any motif to search further, so we need to deduct the length of the motif, so n minus L. So we have the sliding windows, and the number of those sliding windows is n minus L in either case. Now we need to check each of these windows against each of the other windows here, right? All the cross match needs to be done. So how many steps we are actually having in this process? Okay, how many algorithmic steps is going to be, let us say, so this is n minus L, so you will have n minus L windows. So the number of windows is n minus L, right? Now we have to check all versus all. So how many combinations are we having here? So this will be n minus L square, right? So so these many combinations we need to check for two sequences. Now we have total t sequences. So how many total combinations we need to check? All windows versus all windows here, and all windows versus all windows here, and all possible combinations will have n minus L raised to the power t calculation. So now let us look at what is the number that we get here. So we have the length is around 1000 minus L. L is small, let us 4 base pair, so let us say it's not going to affect, it's really small as far as the total length of the larger sequence is concerned. So 1000 raised to the power 100. So that many uh, steps. So that's basically the complexity of the algorithm. So we need to have that many calculations. This is a huge number of calculations. So this again tells us that so this is through brute force rush, right? This is again we are going back to those NP hard, NP complete problems, right? So I would say this will be a NP hard problem, and so you see that it's not feasible. The motive finding through brute force search is actually not a good approach. So this approach is not applicable. So we need a algorithm for which will not give us the deterministic answer, which will not give us exact final answer that this is the motive. Each time you run such an algorithm, you might get slightly different results. But nevertheless, we get around with this problem of getting different results by running the algorithm maybe 10-20 times and see what are the motives which are over represented in most of the runs, right? So one such algorithm is known as Gibbs algorithm. So this is known as Gibbs sampling algorithm. It's a heuristic algorithm, has some stochastic components. Okay, so what do we do in this? So first of all, our input is our set of sequences. So we have this set of sequences, right? For simplicity, let us consider the length of the sequences are same. Now the first step is so since we do not know where the motifs are, and let us say we were told that the motif length is 6, okay, and we need to find a one over represented motif of length 6 here. Now we don't know the positions of motifs. So what we can do is to start with, we need some input, right? We can't just move on with these sequences without having some motif assignment. So let us say we assign the motifs randomly. We say that here is my motif, so what do we call it? Random motif assignment. Right? Okay, so this was the first step. The second step is from these motifs we calculate something. We get a matrix. So you have to stack over these motifs and get what? The position specific scoring matrix. So you take these motifs, align them. This is not a sequence alignment. This is basically stacking because we don't do any adjustment in this alignment. We will learn about sequence alignment in later classes. These are the same of these motifs and we have stacked them over each other, and we obtained a position specific scoring matrix. Right. So this is our second step. This is easy, right? Now you might wonder what is the point of getting this matrix of random sequences, and some of you might already be having a guess that now since we have a starting material with us, let us try to refine this matrix in a way that we get a motif, the more appropriate motifs, which means that we need to now adjust the positions of these motifs in the original set of sequence. And here is the way we do it. What we do is, let us say we take one of the sequence randomly from this set. We take one sequence randomly. Let us say I took this sequence here, right? And what I do is the following. So this is the sequence, right? This is the same sequence. And what I do is the following. Now this was the motif that I randomly assigned in the beginning, right? Now what I'm going to do is, on top of this motif, what I'm trying to draw here is the probability of. So now what I'm going to do is I will scan this matrix. I will scan this matrix on this sequence. Right? Okay, so you know how to scan this matrix, how to search this matrix in a sequence, right? In the last class we learned that we calculate the joint probability, which is coming, and probability values are actually coming from this matrix, and then I see where do I get the maximal value along this, right? So this is a random motif here, right? So now what I do, I try to draw here the probability of finding this M matrix, right? So let us say I get somewhat like this. Now what do you see here? There is something important happening here, and that is that my original motif, since it was random, it doesn't show good probability values which is coming from this matrix when we scan this matrix against this sequence. But we find that there is a slightly better, I made it very striking, but it may not be very striking in the first run. There is, this matrix is somehow able to find a motif which matches well with this matrix elsewhere. Okay, it is here. So in a way, by looking at this curve, okay, by looking at this peak, I'm able to refine my motif position, isn't it? Now I know one thing is that my original random position was not very good. Okay, so I am going to reassign my motif in this sequence and say that my motif is located here. So this is not my motif anymore, this is my motif. Okay, so this is what I did with one of the random sequence. Then after reassignment, this is very important, I put it back, this sequence I put it back. Okay, so place back. So we took it randomly, right? Take a random sequence. So this was my third step, right? That's what I did here. Since I put it back and the sequence position has changed, I have to rerun and get the M, because sequence has changed, the motif has changed now. So the new motif is somewhere here, right? So since the motif has changed, the PSSM will again change, right? Right. So once we put it back, we again calculate the same thing. So we run this cycle, okay, again and again. So we get again a new PSSM which will be slightly better because it gave us better results, and then we again take another random sequence and iterate this process several maybe a few thousand times. Okay, so we need to iterate this process. Let me try to make a cycle here. So in fact there is a cycle, right? You see that there is a cycle going on here, there is a cycle going on here, right? And we repeat this several thousand times. Again, then we have to stop at some point, right? So in algorithms we stop at some point when we get convergence criteria met. When we meet the convergence, we stop. Okay, and that criteria differs from algorithm to algorithm. Let us say that one of the simplest criteria that we can have to converge this is uh, by looking at the change in sites, change in this jumping thing that we are doing, right? If we see that after 10,000 cycles, we see that the motif is not changing its position. Okay, we are running and the change in position that I write delta sites is actually approaching 0, then I stop my algorithm. This can be a very simple criteria, right? Very simple criteria. Much better criteria comes from the quality of this matrix. Okay, so let's look at that. So if we have our PSSM matrix, which was initially random, right? Right, so now this was our M matrix in the previous slide. Now which PSSM matrix is good? So if you recall your Tata box thing, uh, if you have a skew in this matrix where certain alphabets are overrepresented, let us say in the case of Tata we had T here, which was 1.99, and 1 here, and 1 here, and 1 here, right? So we had this skewed position, if a huge skew. This is a complete skew basically. So if you have matrix which is skew, your motif is better, isn't it? It means that this motif is coming in most of the sequences in when you stack them. So this Tata was coming with absolute conservation. In the previous class you saw that, right? So which means that this, let us say this was part of a longer sequence. It means this is one motif because it is present in all of them with absolute conservation. And one of the way we can identify that this is a motif and it is over represented is by looking at the skew in this matrix, right? So how can we calculate? So in the Gibbs sampling, this matrix would be very poor, right? This matrix would actually be in the beginning would be like a random thing, right? It might be 0.25 here, 0.25 here, 0.25 here, and 0.25, and maybe at each position it will be like this. So it's very poor. Uh, However, practically it doesn't happen. You know, because these are not random sequences that we are working upon. Those are coming from experiments. So maybe this is 0.35 here, and this is just 0.15, and so on. There will be some small skew, which actually improves over in the further iterations. This was, let us say, 0.35 in the first iteration. After, let's say, 1000 iterations, this became 0.4. This value. Right, after 10,000 iterations, we learn that this has become 0.5, which is better, and is telling that this position, the second position here, is basically sorry, the first position here is having T there, and this Q is highlighting a better PSSM matrix, right? More skewed the matrix is, better the matrix. Right. Now, how do we actually calculate that this matrix is better? So what we do is, the simplest way is you look at the first column and find out what is the max value here, right? And the same way you do for the second column and find out the maximum value here in this column, and so on here. In this case, it's just going to be 111 here, but let us say fifth and sixth position, these values were different. Let us say this was 0.6 here and 0.4 here and 0.2 here and 0.8 here. So likewise you get the max values here too, right? And so on for each of these values. So the and then you sum them up, right? So all of these max value, you sum them up, and that is your matrix score. This is basically your matrix score, in very simple terms, matrix score. And in your Gibbs sampling, what you do, you try to maximize it, and the way you maximize is you basically look at the make a plot where you plot this x-axis is your iterations of the Gibbs sampling and the y-axis is your score, matrix score, right? Now what you see is that, let us say that in the beginning the score was low, very low here, and then it started improving, and after that there was a plateau reached, right? This value is plateaued here. So you stop at this these number of iterations because it's not improving, the matrix score is not improving no matter how long you continue after this point. So you stop this. So one of the convergence criteria could be this score that we learned here, a very simple score. People have worked out a better score, and which is based on Shannon's entropy. Okay, so you need to learn about Shannon entropy first, and then we'll see how do we calculate it for a position specific scoring matrix. So Shannon entropy is the measure of Shannon's entropy, and you know what the entropy is in thermodynamics. It's the measure of disorder, right? It's the Shannon's entropy is the measure of disorder, or it's the measure of diversity. And one of the common area where people use Shannon's entropy is to look at the ecological diversity in a particular area, find out if there are each species is represented well there, then it means that Shannon entropy is high there because there is a huge diversity. And if it is only populated by human being, a particular area, then Shannon entropy is low there because the diversity is less. So that's one application that you have in ecology. Now, the first of all, you need to understand, we need to describe it in mathematical terms. Okay, so Shannon entropy is defined as the expected value of information content of the outcome of a random variable. Okay, so I'll tell you what is information content. That's coming from information theory. So expected value is given by E of information content random variable x, right? So this is what your Shannon's entropy is, which is given by h of x. Now expected value, I hope most of you understand. The expected value is basically weighted average. Now if I want to give you an example, consider the same example that we had in one of the class, the roll of a dice, right? So how do you get the average value of a dice? So you basically when the dice is fair, then you say 1 by 6 and then this is the probability of observing 6, right, plus. So I am trying to calculate what is the average outcome value when you toss the dice 100 times or 200 times or 1000 times, right? So it's going to be, because it's a fair dice, it will be it can be calculated by this equation. Now when we write this is probability, right, P of particular outcome xi, right, and this is what your outcome xi. Now remember when we have the loaded dice, then this is not going to work. Now you might say that why to actually write it in this form, why not to just say 6 plus 5 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 divided by 6, right? So that is going to be the average value. Well, the ordinary average, but this is the weighted average. Now this might work fine, this is fine, of course it's fine. You take 1 by 6 common and then this is the same thing. However, this will not work if your dice was loaded when these probabilities were not equal. Then this is not going to work. The typical average thing will not work. Then you need weighted average. So again, then it's going to be, let us say 1 by 2. This is for the loaded die. There will be high probability of observing 6 if you recall the HMM class, and then 1 by 10, 5 and so on, right? We add up. So this value here will be different than this one. So we write it as this can be expressed at summation over, so I from 1 to n, let us say, for sum over the product of probability of the event times the outcome of the event. This is your expected value, right? This is the way we express it, right? So let us look at what is the information content. Now in information, so if we have something, some phenomena happening randomly, let us say toss of a coin, okay, and you have 100 such tosses, and we know that the probability of observing head or tail is going to be 0.5, right? So it's not, if something is happening as expected behavior of random variable, then we don't gain any new information. This is the usual thing. So in the theory of information, we gain information when something unusual happens. If the outcome is unusual, then the gain of information is very, very high, right? So let us say you toss a coin 3 times, and in all 3 times you get head, head, head. Now this is unusual, right? Or you toss it 4 times and you get head, 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 right? All 4 times. This happens with a very low probability. However, if it has happened, so what will be the probability to observe head, 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 or headless? It's going to be 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5, right? It's going to be very, very low value, right? So however, given that such a event has happened, we gain information, right? So somehow the information content in information theory is given by the inverse of probability. So it's like this is sometimes also known as surprisal, which means that outcome which is surprising you, right? Low probability event, if it has happened, it is surprising for you. So it's also known as a surprisal sometime. If the probability of an event is higher, okay, then the surprisal value is less. If the probability of event is very low, then surprisal value or information content is very high. So information content I of x is given by uh, inverse of probability, uh, pxi. Now generally it is expressed in log 2 form. So this is the typical equation. So of course this can be written as uh, minus log pxi. So that's the information content. Now, as I said in the previous slide, that your Shannon's entropy given by Hx is actually the expected value weighted average of information content. Right. So then we can place these values inside, and you will learn that this basically becomes, you can rewrite this as sum over pxi times ixi. So now it's easy to place the values. You can place this value in place of ixi, and you will get that the Shannon's entropy is basically, and then this minus sign you can take out, right? So you can write it as sum over pxi times log 2 of pxi. So this is your Shannon entropy equation. Okay, now if you didn't get this, let us discuss an example now. Okay, so let us say the toss of a coin. Okay, how many variables are there first of all? So in this previous slide, this n is the number of variables, basically number of outcomes. You have how many outcomes when you toss a coin? Just two, head or tail. When you have a dice roll, then you have 6 outcomes. So in biology, when you have a sequence ATGC, then you have 4 outcomes out there, right? So 4 variables. So when you toss a coin, then what is the probability? What is the Shannon entropy? Basically, Shannon entropy for a coin toss is going to be minus sum over this is going to be 2 from 1 to 2, right? So just 2 values. And then what is the probability of observing head or tail? Right? So let us not okay, so let's sum it over, because probabilities could be different for head and tail. Let us say if you have a loaded coin, then that is going to be different. So let's just put up the real values. So we take the minus sign outside in Shannon's entropy and sum over. So first it will be for head, the first variable is the probability of observing head is 0.5. This is your pxi times log 2 of pxi, which is 0.5, right? Plus, because we had summation in your Shannon entropy equation, what is the probability of observing tail? is 0.5 times log of 0.5. So this is what the Shannon entropy of a toss, coin toss would be, right? No matter how many tosses are you doing, right? So this is going to be same if uh, the coin was fair. Now this is going to be how much? So 0.5, and then this is going to be -1 and -1. So we get half plus half, and then -1 becomes plus here, because minus times minus is plus, and what is left is 0.5 and 0.5. 0.5 times 1, 0.5 times 1, and minus is outside. So basically this becomes half plus half is 1, and minus is cancelled, so you get 1. Right? When the probability was 0.5, but if your toss, if your coin was not fair, then this probability will be different. Now let us say there is a skew of probabilities. So basically we can make a plot here where we plot pxi here for a coin toss, and then we plot hx here. Now what do you think? So of course this value here is 0.5 here, and this goes up to 1, and this is 0. How would the plot look like? So as we know, entropy is higher when you have higher diversity, and you will have higher diversity of let us say you had 10 tosses of the coin, then the diversity will be high when the coin is fair, right? Because sometimes you'll get sometimes tail, and you have 100 tosses, head tail, head tail, head tail, various different combinations of head tail would appear, right? So there will be no redundancy in your sequence. So it is going to be something like this: head, tail, head, head, tail, tail, head, 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 tail, and so on, right? And in the end you get a pattern where H is having 0.5 and T is having 0.5 probability in the 100 tosses. Well, it is not absolute, but as you increase the number of tosses to 1000, 10,000, this really becomes 0.5, 0.5. Now this is like two different animals, human and let us say human and mouse, or human and dog, and they will be equally represented in a geographical area. And then if total number of species were just 2 in your calculation, then you have a very high entropy, because number of humans are equal to number of dogs out there, so the diversity is high. However, if the coin was not fair and you get more of heads than tail, okay, then which means more human than dogs, then diversity is less, right? So diversity is less means entropy has to be less. So even in this equation, when you put up these values, if you put this value less than 0.5, you will see that the entropy is going to be less here, right? So this curve is basically inverse parabola, where highest value is at 0.5 probability. Okay, now let us look at the PSSM matrix and find out how do we actually calculate Shannon entropy there. Now you would, some of you would have already got the idea that how do we actually get this calculated for Shannon's for a matrix, for a PSSM matrix. Let us say this was the matrix. Now remember, when we try to draw this matrix, and when we are learning about motif search, motif finding, this can be actually extended to protein sequence analysis, where the matrix size, the number of rows in the matrix will be 20. The concept doesn't change. Let's say these were the 3 positions. right? So what we do is to find out how skewed the distribution is in the first case, in the first position, we calculate the Shannon entropy here. So we calculate Hx here, right? And same way we calculate the Hx here. Now, in case of Tata Box, we had this value 1, this value 1, and this value 1, right? And so on. So it was highly skewed, right? The Shannon entropy is going to be less. This value would be less for the skewed matrix. However, if there was a matrix which was just having this value was just 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, then the entropy will be high there, right? So now it is inverse of what we learned in the last method, where we look at the max value. Now entropy, if it is low, it is good, right? And then what the simple thing is, you add them up, right? So it tells you, so now your objective should be to minimize the Shannon entropy in your Gibbs sampling. Okay, so now what will be the if it is 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25 for each of the bases, then what will the Shannon entropy? So with 2 variables it was 1, for 4 variables it is going to be 2. You can do the calculations in the so this is your Hx value for 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, right? So each base is equally present at first position. So this Hx is 2, which means that the Shannon entropy, highest Shannon entropy or maximal Shannon entropy would be 2, right? So there is another way that by which we can actually so this minimizing Shannon entropy, if this seems inconvenience to you, then what we can do is we can take the max entropy possible with the 4 variables ATGC and subtract your Shannon entropy, observed Shannon entropy from this, and whatever you get here, now you have to maximize that, right? Now this value you need to maximize. So people do that. This is basically gain of entropy that you can call, or change in entropy from the max value that you can maximize. Either way is fine, right? So this is the way we calculate the Shannon entropy, which can be used as a function to be maximized, or sorry, minimized in your Gibbs sampling. Now Shannon entropy has lot of application. For example, you can also do calculation of Shannon entropy for sequence complexity. So let us say you have this sequence and you have let's say you have 3 sequences. Now all this is also applicable when we talk about the sequences, it's applicable to protein sequence also. Now this sequence was, let us say it was just AAA, this is a poly A sequence. So this is just the adenine sequence coming, and then you do have such scenario in human genome. Many places you just have adenine throughout, and then you can have also have a scenario where there is a adenine, thymine, thymine. These are some hypothetical sequence I am drawing, but many of them are actually present as a repeat sequence in human genome and other mammalian genomes also. And let us say this one is ATGC, all are equally present. Okay, where do you think the entropy would be high? Now here I need to calculate entropy in this way. Okay, in your matrix you are calculating So ATGC was here. You are calculating in this way. Now you have to calculate in this way, and we know that Hx here is going to be very low. Why? Because there is no diversity. It's just the one animal present in an ecosystem, right? Here there are two animals present, so Hx is going to be relatively higher, and in this case all four are present, so this is going to be max, right? This is very high. Basically this is max given the four variables. This is will be the max entropy. Now you might wonder, where is this useful? It's pretty much useful to look at to really find out how complex a sequence is, to find out whether the repeat sequence are present or not. For example, one application is if you have a protein sequence and you have a region which is disordered, right? So this one is disordered region, unfolded region, intrinsically disordered. It doesn't fold into a particular secondary structure or tertiary structure because of the composition of amino acids. You will have more of charged amino acids, which are so the net charge will be high and the hydrophobicity will be less. So if you plot hydrophobicity and the net charge, and if your protein or a part of a protein is falling in this region, and then you have let us say a lot of proteins are here, and then you have other proteins which are coming over here, right? So it tells you that these proteins are having high hydrophobicity and low net charge, which means that if there was a plus charge, there are several plus charged amino acids, there will be negatively charged amino acids also, and they will make electrostatic interaction and it will fold properly like this one. While here it's telling you that hydrophobicity is low, so there will be no hydrophobic collapse during the folding. So there will be no hydrophobic entropy driven interactions, number one. Number two, the net charge is high, which means either the plus charge is high or the minus charge is high. So if this is the case, then it is not going to fold because of lack of electrostatic interaction and repulsion within positive to positive and negative to negative charge. So they are going to make a unfolded structure, and these are going to make a folded structure of protein. You can, in fact, there is a line that demarcates this. That's called Uversky's line, because of the scientist who Uversky's line, which demarcates the order from disorder. Nevertheless, so this might come later on when we learn about protein structures. Now once you have such a region, and if you calculate, let us say, throughout this protein sequence, I am going to calculate the Shannon entropy. So when it is folded, the Shannon entropy is going to be relatively higher in the folded region. The moment you come in the unfolded one, you will have lesser Shannon entropy. Why? Because the way these regions have evolved, first of all, there will be repetitions of the charged amino acid, particularly a single charge, either plus or minus. Number two, they have evolved by duplication. Okay, so there is a repetition of certain amino acid like serine would be there, or N is coming up there, or asparagine is coming in repeats. So because of these repeats, the entropy is less. Okay, so the sequence complexity can be measured by Shannon's entropy, and if the sequence complexity is less, which means that fewer amino acids are overrepresented, then the Shannon entropy is going to be very less over there. Now one of the best example of this disorder is your histone tails, right? Histone tails. So N-terminal of histones are intrinsically disordered, and lot of epigenetic modification, post-translational modifications happens over there, which includes acetylation, your methylation, ubiquitination, and so on. Now this tail is rich in lysine and arginine, which are positively charged, right? So these are positively charged amino acids, which is why this region doesn't fold properly into a secondary structure because of repulsion between positively charged amino acids. Secondly, this positively charged amino acids also helps this region to bind to negatively charged DNA. Alright, so likewise in DNA sequences also, if you really want to find out the repetitive sequences, the satellite sequences in a particular window size, then you can scan the genome for Shannon entropy. However, there are other ways, better ways to find out the repeat elements. So that was all for the day. Let us meet on Friday to discuss your assignment.